This next lesson will cover urban patterns, chapter 13, looking at key issue 2, and we are continuing with key issue 2. This is part B. You already had part A in a previous lesson. Part 2 will also utilize the three models that help us better understand spatial association and patterns, but in this case we're going to be looking at developing countries. Cities in developing countries may date from ancient times. For most of recorded history, the world's largest cities have been in Asia. However, until modern times, most Asians lived in rural settlements. The ancient and medieval structure of these cities was influenced by the cultural values of the indigenous people living there, and in most cases, these cities passed through a period of restructuring at the hands of European colonial rulers. Take a look at figure 13-25, located on page 472 of your textbook. This is Beijing during the Yuan dynasty. Kublai Khan, founder of the Yuan dynasty, constructed a new city called Dadu, beginning in 1267. The Drum Tower was constructed at the center of the city. The heart of Dadu was three palaces built on Kainghua Island in the middle of Tai Lake. The two palaces to the west of the lake housed the imperial family, and the eastern one contained offices. Residential areas were laid out in a checkerboard pattern divided by wider roads and narrower alleys. Three markets were placed in the residential areas. An outer wall surrounded the residential areas and an inner wall surrounded the palaces. Figure 13-26 shows the Yuan dynasty in Beijing, and this is the Drum Tower, which was built in the 13th century. The image was taken from the bell tower, also from the 13th century. The Drum Tower was the center of Dadu and the city that eventually became Beijing. After capturing Dadu in 1368, the Ming Dynasty reconstructed over the next several decades. The imperial palace was demolished and replaced with new structures, including the Forbidden City and the Temple of Heaven, which you see here in 13-27. Other temples were added in the 16th century, and the city took on the current name, Beijing. We're now going to be talking about colonial legacies. When Europeans gained control of much of Africa, Asia, and Latin America, their colonial policies left a heavy mark on many cities that still exist today. In some places, European colonial powers built a new city next to the existing one. Take Fez, Morocco, for example. In this city, it consisted of two separate and distinct nodes: a pre-colonial city that existed before the French gained control, and one built by the French colonialists. Looking at figure 13-28, we can see the French colonial city of Fez and compare that to the city of Medina that was pre-colonial. We see that the streets are much more dense and the patterns are much more distinctive between the two. The new city was the location for colonial services like administration, military command, and international trade, as well as housing for European colonists. Compared to the pre-colonial node, the European district contained wider streets and public squares, larger houses surrounded by gardens, and a much lower density. Similarly, the British built New Delhi near the existing city of Delhi, India. Old Delhi was characterized by narrow, winding streets and densely packed buildings, whereas New Delhi had broad boulevards and large government structures. In other cases, European colonial powers simply demolished the pre-colonial city. For example, the French colonial city of Saigon, Vietnam, now Ho Chi Minh City, was built by completely demolishing the existing city without leaving a trace. In figure 13-30, we see in Vietnam through this map that French colonial authorities demolished the old city and imposed their own ideals of urban form. This included buildings like the one you see here in image B, like the Cathedral of Notre Dame, still existing in Ho Chi Minh. We will now apply the models to developing countries. The three models of urban structure described earlier was the concentric zone model, the sector model, and the multiple nuclei model. They help to explain contemporary patterns within the urban areas of developing countries. Rapid growth of population and land area has strengthened the applicability of the models in some cities, but reduced their usefulness in others. Looking at figure 13-31, located on page 474 of your textbook, we can see the models of urban structure have been adapted to fit different developing countries. In developing countries, as we see the models applied, they also have been modified by different individuals. For example, the concentric zone model was modified by Deblush to model cities in sub-Saharan Africa. In B, McGee modeled a Southeast Asian city with multiple nuclei. And in C, Griffin Ford applied a sector model to Latin American cities. The concentric zone model has been applied most frequently to cities in developing countries. Geographer Harm Deblage's model of sub-Saharan African cities is an example. The inner rings house higher income people. Inner rings have the most attractive residential areas because they are near business and consumer services, and they offer vital public services like water, electricity, paved roads, and garbage pickup. Take a look at figure 13-32, applying the concentric zone in Curitiba, Brazil. High-income people are more likely to live in an inner ring on the concentric model, whereas low-income people are in outer rings. As cities grow rapidly in developing countries, rings are constantly being added on the periphery to accommodate immigrants from rural areas attracted to job opportunities. Much of the housing in the outer rings is informal settlements, also known as squatter settlements, as you can see here in figure 13-33. Informal settlements are frequently found in large urban settlements in developing countries. The informal settlement pictured here is in Mumbai, India. The United Nations defines an informal settlement as a residential area where housing has been built on land of which the occupants have no legal claim or has not been built to the city's standards for legal buildings. These settlements are known by a variety of names in different countries, but most commonly we refer to them as favelas or barrios in Latin America. Informal settlements have few services because neither the city nor the residents can afford them. Homes may be in primitive shelters made with things like cardboard, wood boxes, or crushed beverage cans, and they typically lack basic sewage systems, access to water and electricity, and people that live there may also have to travel very far, walk maybe 2 hours to reach a place of employment, as public transportation services may also not be readily available. Take a look at figure 13-34 located on page 475 of your textbook. The division of races in Pietermaritzburg under apartheid in South Africa followed a multiple nuclei model. Cities in some developing countries show evidence of the multiple nuclei model by containing a complex mix of ethnic groups. During the apartheid era, South Africa's cities showed especially clear evidence of the multiple nuclei model because each race was segregated into distinct neighborhoods. You can see that in the image above. Geographers Griffin and Ford show that in Latin American cities, wealthy people push out from the center in a well-defined elite residential sector. The elite sector forms on either side of a narrow spine that contains offices, shops, and amenities attractive to wealthy people, like restaurants, theaters, parks, and zoos. The wealthy are also attracted to the center and spine because services like water and electricity are more readily available and reliable there than elsewhere. Wealthy and middle-class residents avoid living near sectors of disamenity, which are land uses that may be noisy or polluting or that cater to low-income residents. Sao Paulo, Brazil, has an elite sector extending from the south of the CBD. The UN's Human Development Index discussed this in Chapter 10, and it can also be used to display multiple factors that are characteristics of elite sectors, including relatively high incomes, education levels, and life expectancies. At the same time, Sao Paulo demonstrates elements of the concentric zone model, with most of the informal settlements located in an outer ring. Informal settlements occupy 23% of Sao Paulo's land area and are home to around 1.8 million people, or 17% of the city's population. One of the last concepts we will cover in Key Issue 2, Chapter 13, is changing urban structure in Mexico City. We will be looking at the 3 stages of development of Mexico City, first looking at pre-colonial Tenochtitlan, which is the island and lake Texcoco. Then we'll be looking at colonial Mexico City, which was demolished and rebuilt in the Spanish model. And then we'll be looking at what Mexico has looked like since independence and its rapid growth. Mexico City provides a good example of a city in a developing country that has passed through 3 stages of development: pre-European origin, the European colonial period, and post-colonial independence. Take a look at Figure 13-36. The site of Tenochtitlan was an island in a lake and marsh. It was the Aztecs that founded Mexico City. When forced by others to leave the hill, they migrated a few kilometers south, near the present-day city of the University of Mexico, and then in 1325 to a marshy 10-square-kilometer island in Lake Texcoco. The node of religious life was the Great Temple. 3 causeways and drawbridges linked Tenochtitlan to the mainland and also helped control flooding. Most food, merchandise, and building materials crossed from the mainland to the island by boat, and the island was laced with canals to facilitate movement. Over the next 2 centuries, the Aztecs conquered the neighboring peoples and extended their control through much of present-day Mexico. As their wealth and power grew, Tenochtitlan grew to a population of 500,000. Figure 13-38 shows the center of colonial Mexico City was the main square, located near the site of the demolished Templo Mayor. The Spanish conquered Tenochtitlan in 1521 after a 2-year siege. They destroyed Tenochtitlan and dispersed or killed most of the inhabitants and constructed a new city on the site. As in other colonial cities, the Spanish built Mexico City around a main square called the Zocalo, on the site of the Aztecs' sacred precinct in the center of the island. Streets were laid out in a grid pattern extending from the Zocalo. Here you see the Zocalo, and around it you see the grid patterns. At independence, Mexico City was a relatively small city, and the population grew modestly during the 19th century, reaching around 500,000 in 1900. The population grew rapidly during the 20th century to 3 million in 1950 and 21 million in the urban area in 2015. Millions of people have migrated to the cities in search for work. Check out the city since independence. Figure 13-39 shows Mexico City has grown rapidly in the last century. Figures 13-40 and 13-41 show Mexico City's informal settlements are in an outer ring to the left, and the Paseo de la Reforma represents a wealthy sector extending out from the city center. As Mexico City's population grew rapidly during the 20th century, the social patterns inherited from the 19th century were reinforced. This is the end of Key Issue 2 for Chapter 13 on urban patterns.